Love is not supposed to feel like a battle against yourself, but for many people, that's exactly what it becomes. A slow erosion of your identity disguised as commitment. You wake up one day realizing you're more emotionally invested than ever, but somehow more disconnected from your own needs, your goals, your truth. This isn't just a relationship problem, this is an identity crisis, the kind that builds in silence. It's not loud, it doesn't scream, it whispers doubts that echo through every corner of your mind. Am I too much? Why do I always care more? What else can I do to make them stay? These are the questions that signal you're not just trying to love someone, you're trying not to lose them at the cost of losing yourself. What if I told you that the most common way people show love, through effort, attention, sacrifice, and hyper-availability, is often driven by fear, not connection? That you're over-explaining, you're overthinking, the subtle emotional negotiations you make daily, all stem from a deep-seated anxiety of not being enough on your own? You've probably noticed this pattern in your past. They grow distant, and you move closer. They hesitate, and you lean in harder. You don't do it to manipulate. You do it because every fiber of your nervous system is wired to seek safety through closeness. You equate proximity with peace. But what if that instinct is leading you away from the very connection you're craving? Losing yourself in love. Losing yourself in love rarely happens all at once. It's not a dramatic scene. It's a series of small, almost invisible compromises. It's replying immediately to a text even when you're in the middle of something important. It's canceling plans with friends because your partner suddenly became available. It's hesitating to voice discomfort, swallowing your needs to keep the peace. These choices seem harmless in the moment, but over time, they form a pattern of emotional self-neglect disguised as affection. You tell yourself you're being flexible, understanding, devoted. What you're actually doing is training your nervous system to accept that your needs are secondary, that your presence is only valuable if it doesn't disturb the emotional rhythm of another person. This is how emotional dependency masquerades as love. You begin to assess your worth by how well you're received. Your mood depends on their availability. Your sense of stability depends on whether or not they're in a good place to be close to you. You start measuring your value by their attention. And love becomes less about being seen and more about being chosen. Again and again and again. It's a silent desperation, not always visible to others, but profoundly exhausting to you. You go to sleep feeling stretched thin, not because you gave too much, but because nothing you give ever seems to be enough. The deeper tragedy is that society often applauds this kind of giving. We're taught that sacrifice is noble, that the more we do, the more we prove our love. But there's a line between generosity and self-erasure. And when you cross it, you don't just risk your emotional well-being, you lose clarity about who you are without them. You forget what it's like to enjoy your own company. You forget what it means to make decisions without checking how it might affect them. You forget that your life has direction even when you're standing still. And here's the quiet irony. The more you abandon yourself to hold the relationship together, the more disconnected it becomes. Love, real love, thrives not when you disappear to maintain it, but when you show up fully, needs, boundaries, emotions, and all. When you shrink, you leave your partner loving a version of you that isn't even there. And if they fall in love with that version, what does that say about what you've taught them to expect from you? This isn't your fault. These patterns are often inherited. You may have learned from a young age that love had to be earned, that staying quiet kept you safe, that making yourself easy to love meant suppressing the parts of you that might be too much, too emotional, too inconvenient. But the love you deserve, the kind that heals, grows, and empowers, will never require you to vanish in order to be held. So, the first shift must be internal. You have to redefine what it means to love. You have to begin treating your identity not as a negotiation, but as a foundation. Because love without self is just survival in disguise. And you weren't born to survive your relationships. You were born to thrive in them. Attachment theory and the hidden emotional blueprints behind your patterns. Understanding your behavior in love requires looking at more than just your current relationship. It demands looking inward, toward the blueprint your nervous system has followed for years. Attachment theory isn't just psychology jargon. It's the emotional map that shapes how we give, receive, and protect love. And for many, that map was drawn in childhood, when our brains were still developing, and our only goal was to feel safe. If you consistently find yourself loving too much, giving too soon, needing constant reassurance, or panicking at emotional distance, you're not broken. You're likely operating from an anxious attachment style. This pattern usually develops when love was inconsistent growing up. Maybe one parent was emotionally unavailable, distracted, overwhelmed, or hot and cold. Maybe affection was earned through performance, behavior, or emotional caretaking. Over time, your nervous system learned that love wasn't something freely given. It had to be earned, maintained, protected. And the cost of losing it was too great to risk. So, you adapted. You became hyper-attuned to shifts in mood, tone, energy. You learned how to keep the peace, how to anticipate needs, how to soften your own to avoid conflict or rejection. You may not even be aware you're doing it, but your body remembers the early panic of emotional absence. And now, in adulthood, your inner world reacts with the same urgency to silence, to delayed texts, to a lack of emotional responsiveness. On the surface, you might say you're just sensitive, intuitive, loyal. But underneath, there's often a fear that you are fundamentally too much or not enough. And that fear drives every overreach. You try harder, you reach out more, you compromise, you explain yourself, justify your needs, offer endless empathy in hopes that this time someone will stay and meet you halfway. But this pursuit doesn't satisfy. It burns you out. Because it's not love you're really chasing, it's safety. And emotional safety can't be sustained if it depends entirely on the stability of someone else's nervous system. Now consider the partner you're often drawn to, the avoidant one, the one who seems interested but distant, present but unavailable. They grew up with a different blueprint. Emotional closeness in their world may have been overwhelming, invasive, or inconsistent in a different way. Maybe their caregivers were critical, controlling, or emotionally absent. So they learned to equate independence with safety. Intimacy became a threat to their autonomy. Vulnerability meant exposure, not connection. So when you pursue, they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because their wiring interprets emotional intensity as pressure. They feel engulfed by the very closeness you crave. And this creates a painful emotional seesaw. The more anxious you get, the more distance they create. The more distance they create, the more anxious you get. And neither of you wins. This doesn't mean your love isn't real, but it means the blueprint needs revising. If you continue to operate from unhealed patterns, your relationships will keep reenacting the same emotional scripts under different names. Healing begins when you stop trying to manage another person's availability and start addressing your own attachment to their presence. That's why secure energy is not just a concept, it's a commitment. It's deciding that your worth is not up for debate based on how someone else responds. It's building the internal scaffolding to stay regulated even when things are uncertain. It's learning to self-soothe instead of chase. It's choosing not to confuse peace with apathy and distance with rejection. True intimacy doesn't start with someone getting closer to you. It starts with you getting closer to yourself. Because the person who is deeply anchored in their own emotional landscape becomes less susceptible to the chaos of another's. You begin to love with boundaries, with discernment, with clarity, not with anxiety dressed up as devotion. Emotional self-trust, becoming your own source of safety and validation. The root of most relational anxiety is not about love, it's about safety. We don't fear losing people because we're weak. We fear it because somewhere along the way, we came to believe that our emotional well-being depends on someone else staying close. That belief isn't always conscious, but it's deeply embedded in the emotional architecture of people who grew up in environments where affection was unpredictable, conditional, or withheld. So here's a foundational truth. Emotional self-trust is the antidote to relationship chaos. It's what allows you to stay grounded when someone else pulls away. It's the internal compass that guides your actions, your words, and your boundaries, not in reaction to someone else, but in alignment with who you are. Without emotional self-trust, you will constantly outsource your emotional regulation. You'll look to their tone, their responsiveness, their attention as signals for how you should feel. And when they withdraw, your entire nervous system floods with fear. This is where many people fall into cycles of over-explaining, over-giving, or over-apologizing. You try to fix their distance with more of yourself. You try to win them back with your effort. But what you're really doing is negotiating for emotional stability, using someone else's unpredictability. That's not love, that's survival behavior. And survival behavior creates deep emotional fatigue because no matter how much you give, it's never quite enough to calm your own fear. But when you build emotional self-trust, the game changes entirely. You stop needing others to behave a certain way in order for you to feel okay. You start recognizing your own emotional patterns and learning how to soothe them without external validation. You build rituals of calm. You create emotional boundaries, not as walls to keep people out, but as sacred lines that protect your peace. This level of trust doesn't come from theory. It comes from practice. It comes from catching yourself in moments of spiraling and gently pausing. It comes from asking, what is true for me right now? Instead of, what are they thinking about me? It comes from redirecting the question, how do I get them to stay? To, am I staying true to myself? This work is subtle but profound. Over time, you begin to notice that your reactions become responses. Your silence is no longer passive, it's intentional. You no longer rush to fix discomfort. You learn to sit with it, observe it, and choose from clarity, not panic. That's emotional maturity. And it's incredibly magnetic, because in relationships, the most attractive quality isn't confidence, it's coherence. It's when your inner world and outer actions align, when you can say no without guilt, when you can feel anxious without acting from that anxiety, when you can hold space for connection without needing it to complete you. That is power, that is peace. And ironically, when you no longer need someone to make you feel safe, they often feel safer around you. The pressure lifts, the dynamic softens. Real intimacy becomes possible, not because you chased it, but because you became a safe place, first for yourself and then for them. So ask yourself this: if they left, would you still recognize yourself? If they changed, could you still stand grounded in your truth? If the answer is no, then your next relationship isn't with another person. It's with your own emotional center. Reframing connection, love as a preference, not a panic response. At some point in your healing, a profound shift begins to unfold. You stop chasing connection as if it's a cure. You stop measuring your worth by someone else's attention. And you start realizing that love, true, healthy, reciprocal love, is a preference, not a prescription for survival. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It begins with an uncomfortable truth. The desperation you felt in some of your relationships was never about that specific person. It was about what their presence represented. For many people, being in a relationship symbolizes stability, validation, and proof that they are lovable. So, when someone pulls away, it feels like more than rejection. It feels like emotional annihilation. Not because the relationship was perfect, but because your nervous system was conditioned to view closeness as a life raft. This is where emotional sovereignty changes everything. Emotional sovereignty means you no longer approach connection as a lifeline. You approach it as a choice, one made from groundedness, not urgency. You don't need to be chosen in order to feel whole. You are whole. And that wholeness gives you the freedom to evaluate relationships through a clear lens. Does this nourish me? Does this respect me? Does this feel reciprocal? When connection becomes a preference rather than a panic response, the entire emotional dynamic shifts. You no longer beg for breadcrumbs because you no longer see love as scarce. You don't need someone else to plug the holes in your heart because you've done the patchwork yourself. You're not perfect, but you're present. Present to your own needs, present to your boundaries, present to the kind of energy you allow into your space. This doesn't make you cold or unfeeling. In fact, it makes you more loving. Because love born from wholeness is not possessive. It doesn't demand, it doesn't chase, it offers, it invites. It trusts that those who are meant to stay will, and those who are not, will pass through without creating chaos. And in that trust, you find peace. Consider how many times in your life you've overextended just to avoid abandonment. How often you've clung to connection, not because it was fulfilling, but because you were afraid of the void it would leave behind. Now imagine if your sense of self was so intact, so internally sourced, that someone's absence didn't dismantle you, it simply redirected you. That is the power of reframing love. Because real connection doesn't come from trying harder, it comes from seeing clearly. It comes from knowing that your peace is not up for compromise, and your presence is not a prize to be negotiated. When you no longer fear being alone, you stop attracting connections that mirror your fears. Instead, you draw in people who are aligned with your healed frequency, who meet your love with equal grace, not resistance. So, the next time someone pulls away, don't panic, don't perform. Pause, reflect, ask, do I want this connection because it enhances my life, or because I'm afraid of losing it? Your answer to that question will reveal whether you're loving from clarity or from compulsion. And that awareness is the foundation for every truly healthy relationship you'll ever have. Becoming the emotional space where love can land. There's a moment, often quiet, where everything clicks. It's not dramatic. It doesn't require someone apologizing or returning. It doesn't even need closure from the people who hurt you. It's a moment of radical inner awakening, when you finally realize that the peace you were chasing through relationships is something you can generate within yourself. This is what it means to become the emotional space where love can land. You stop clinging to the idea that love needs to be proven through suffering. You stop equating your worth with your ability to endure neglect. You stop chasing people who mistake availability for weakness and start attracting those who respect stillness as strength. The people who will feel safe with your steadiness, not threatened by it. The people who don't require you to shrink or stretch into someone else just to keep their attention. To become that space, you build emotional architecture inside of you that doesn't collapse under uncertainty. You learn to sit with your needs without judging them. You learn to express desire without wrapping it in anxiety. You can say, I want closeness, without meaning, I can't survive without you. That distinction changes everything, because from that emotional altitude, your love becomes a gift, not a transaction. You give without the echo of desperation. You listen without preloading responses. You exist in connection not to fulfill a role, but to share your essence. And that is where love flourishes, not in the frantic effort to convince someone to stay, but in the calm space where staying becomes a natural choice. Not because they feel guilt, obligation, or pressure, but because your presence invites peace. It signals, you are safe here, but you are not responsible for my emotional balance. That level of emotional maturity is rare, and when you reach it, everything about the way you relate changes. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You stop trying to manage someone else's emotional state to protect your own. You stop waiting for someone to choose you before you choose yourself. And most importantly, you begin to understand that connection built from coherence is infinitely more powerful than connection built from control. When your inner world is regulated, your relationships don't need to be perfect to feel safe. You can navigate distance with dignity. You can accept changes in rhythm without spiraling. You can love people fully without needing them to be your emotional foundation. Because that foundation, you've already built it, brick by brick, moment by moment, through every painful lesson that taught you how to return to yourself. This is not detachment. This is not apathy. This is presence, maturity, and clarity fused together. This is emotional freedom. And in that freedom, you stop trying to be someone's everything and start becoming everything to yourself. Not in isolation, but in self-reclamation. When you lead with secure energy, you don't try to get love. You become the place where love naturally wants to rest, where honesty is welcomed, where affection doesn't feel like an obligation, where intimacy is not a test, but a shared discovery. And that changes everything, not just in how others respond to you, but in how you respond to yourself. If you made it to this point, if something in this journey stirred you, challenged you, maybe even healed a piece of you, I want you to comment unstoppable below, because that's what you are. Not just someone learning how to love others better, but someone finally remembering how to love themselves from the inside out. And if this message touched your heart, share it. Send it to someone who's been stuck in the same cycles, who's been chasing what they thought was love, but was really just emotional survival. Because healing happens faster when we walk it together.